Hello everybody and welcome back to another quick Dwarf Fortress tutorial. In this video I'm going to be covering my recommended settings for Dwarf Fortress. These are the settings that I use to play the game, as well as talking about a couple other settings. So we're going to hit escape on the keyboard and pop open the settings menu. Now the first thing that you're going to see here upon entering into the settings menu is you're going to see the windowed and full screen options. Now I play the game in window mode. The full screen options, this is the resolution for full screen. For windowed, this is the resolution for windowed. So I play at 1600 by 900 in a window. That is completely up to you. You do exactly what you want to do. I set it so that it's 1600 by 900 and then you hit minus and then plus because for some reason it doesn't register that you changed it when you restart the game. This does require a game restart to make function, unless you want to just click and drag your window. Once I have it set, I then set it so that the window is not resizable on restart. This just stops me from accidentally resizing my window. But again, you can set that to whatever you wish. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is the maximum interface percentage, not counting minimap. Now, there's this lovely little option here, which allows you to just do that by default, which is this. So by default, the interface just has its own pixel perfect sizing, but if you turn this on, it resizes it to whatever your resolution is. This will give you like UI that fits better, and if you have certain UI elements that are missing or you can't see stuff, you may want to fiddle with these three settings, the grid height, the interface scaling percentage, and whatnot, just so that you're certain that the game fits your screen. If you're playing in a super ultra wide monitor, sometimes the game can be a little bit fiddly, but you should see all of these UI elements that you see around the edge of the screen right now. The next thing I'm going to talk about is graphical FPS. Now, default for this is 50, but as you can see, I have it set to 60. The graphical FPS is what the game uses to process the UI. So specifically, the UI and the graphics, the closer that is to your monitor, the better the game will feel. I set this to 60 because I have a 60 FPS monitor. If you're using a 144 FPS monitor, you might want to crank this up a little bit. But this doesn't actually affect the speed of the game. That is a different setting in the game settings, which we'll get to in a little bit. Now we've made it into game settings. So first off, you have got your seasonal saving. Set that to seasonal. Do not change that. You want as frequent saves as possible so that you have the highest chance of being able to recover lost progress and the odd chance that there's a crash. I generally get a crash maybe every 100 hours or so, but your results may vary on there based on how many mods you're using or how much you're messing around with the game itself. There are certain things that can cause the game to just kind of and fall over, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as we get further down this screen. You can also see temperature, weather, and cave-ins. Now, if you want to make a floating Minecraft world, you want to disable cave-ins because otherwise the world's going to start caving in once you start to, remove all the supports for things. So if you want to do floating islands or any silly shenanigans like that, you can do that by disabling cave-ins, but I leave them on. Temperature and weather are two of the highest recommended things that I see people turning on specifically to fix frame rate. Weather only really matters if you are building above ground a lot, and if you are running into frame rate issues, maybe fiddle with that. Temperature, not really going to cause you too many problems unless you either are on a volcano and there's a lot of snow everywhere, or alternatively, if you are pumping lava from underground to the surface and there's a lot of ice everywhere, or if you, say, have a bunch of creatures running around that are made out of snow and fire, that can cause some issues when they try and walk past each other because the game's trying to cool them down and heat them up and also change the temperature of the general surroundings around them, which can cause some weird frame rate math. So if you're running into issues with frame rate, you may fiddle with those settings, but keep in mind, in general, in most circumstances, turning these off will actually just cause issues with the game, such as weird puddles of lava not evaporating and water doing strange things. So just keep that in mind if you're going to start messing with temperature and weather, because if you start seeing weird anomalies, you may want to re-enable those pretty quick because it can cause some issues. A walking spread splatter is something that I really like to turn on. It does cause some issues with dwarves running in and out of the fortress, especially if there's liquids everywhere. But that being said, I think it's kind of great when a dwarf vomits and a dwarf's bleeding and there's some weird mud everywhere, and then a dwarf runs through and tracks it into the fort. I think it's just more believable, but if you want your fortresses to look pristine and clean, you may want to disable this. I do leave keyboard cursor disabled because, frankly, the game is mouse-driven now, and I don't see the reason for that to be on at this point, but that is up to you. Multi-threading generally adds about a 15% frame rate increase on my rig. This is disabled by default, so you may want to turn this on if you are are one of those people who insists that multi-threading is increasing the frame rate, and currently aren't playing with that. Because they did add some basic multi-threading specifically for just the line of sight code for the dwarves themselves. Nothing else is multi-threaded in the game, just that. Well, the graphics technically runs on a second thread, but that's a bit of a different subject. Because the multi-threading is only for one specific part of the game, this may give you a huge frame rate boost, or it may give you a small frame rate boost. It kind of depends on how you build your fort and what is happening. This does cause crashes in some cases, so keep that. So if you're getting a repeated crash you can't figure out, maybe try disabling this and see if the game still crashes, and then send your fort in to be looked at by the developers. Now this next one, this is something that a lot of new players I think miss. When you're getting large amounts of migrants, this is because you're selling a lot of stuff to your trade wagons. The amount of migrants you get is based on the amount of wealth that you are exporting. Now, if you're suddenly finding yourself with way too many migrants and you can't keep up with them, or you just want to build slower, you can actually adjust your population cap. So by default, it's set to 200 and 220 up here. The baby and child cap is set to 100, so you can have up to a maximum of 100 children, 200 dwarves, and 220 total. Now, we can decrease these numbers. So let's just say you only want 50 dwarves in your fort, and then 60 total, and then let's just say you only want 15 of those to be babies. Then this will allow you to very much customize the number of dwarves that you have. We're going to turn all this back to the default so I don't forget to change them back later, but just keep in mind that if you are running into more dwarves than you can handle, you can turn that down. Same with visitors. If you're just like, man, I have 100 visitors nonstop and it's insane and they're constantly asking to join, maybe just set this to like 5. And then you'll get a couple bards coming around and a couple weird mercenaries coming around, but you'll never get completely flooded by the default 100. Engraving start obscured is primarily something for ASCII. If you do not want to see the engravings that your dwarves have made, because in ASCII it can make the game actually almost unplayable because it's impossible to discern between a wall and a floor. If you would like to turn that on, it'll make life in ASCII a little bit clearer. Or alternatively, if you don't like the look of the dwarven engravings on the floor, you can also disable that there, and then you just won't see them. The rest of these can be adjusted while it's in game, including the numeric liquid levels, so we'll just keep scrolling down. And now we've hit the games per second cap. Now, this is set to 80 because that's what I like to start at, but by default it sits at 100. This number here is essentially the speed that the game runs at. It will clock your CPU as fast as it can go, and it will just propel the dwarves through the fortress. Now, this can be set all the way up to 1,000 or to a minimum of 5, and this is basically the rate at which the game does the math to figure out exactly what every dwarf is doing. If you are running at a frame rate that you think feels too fast or the game is progressing too quickly, I know certainly a lot of new players go, oh my god, the dwarves move so quick. You can absolutely just set this to 30 and have a much more reasonable move speed. For me, when I start a new fortress, I start off at about 80 frames a second, and then the game naturally slows down as more and more dwarves arrive, and the fort gets bigger. And by the time I get to endgame, usually my forts run anywhere from 30 to 50 frames a second, depending on the fort or how well I've built it. If I've built it really well, I might even be upwards of 70. But it depends on the fortress layout and exactly what's going on the map. Now, lastly, we have compressed saves. I usually don't compress saves because it does speed up save, load, and auto-save time significantly. However, I have many terabytes of storage, so I'm not too worried about my saves being 5 gigs. But if you're limited on storage, you definitely want to turn this on. If you're not worried about storage, don't worry about it too much. Next up, we have control settings. Now, this is entirely up to you. If you personally feel that the game's control scheme feels off to you, feel free to adjust these as you see fit. I personally have just been going through and doing my best to learn the default bindings. And up until recently, I was also swapping it so that when you zoomed or moved up and down with the mouse wheel in the Z levels, I used to mirror those, but at some point in recent patches, they swapped it. So now when you zoom out, it feels more natural than it did before. The first few builds of this version had it set so that it felt like the controls were mirrored for some reason, but that has seemingly been changed. So let's dive over to announcements now. Now, announcements is a very, very big list of things, but fortunately, we can filter these a little bit. Now, you'll notice that a lot of these are filtered into different sections. So let's start on the right and move this way. So we have alert. Essentially, this means that anything that pops up on alert is going to give you a big red pop-up at the start of the screen. These are things like a siege or a notice that you need to deal with right now. You click it, it gives you a full screen pop-ups telling you what's going on. These are only for the most important events. Then we have active reports and inactive reports. These are less important. You don't need to worry about them so much. And then we have adventure mode and fortress mode settings. And then we have our options. Pop-up puts a pop-up in the center of the screen that you can click OK. And then when you click OK, it'll just the game will keep playing if the game was playing. Now, if you set this to pause, when you click OK on the pop-up, the game will remain paused until you unpause it. Recenter then recenters on the event. So you can just pause and recenter, you can just recenter, or you can just have the pop-up. It is up to you, or you can just disable it entirely by, say, turning it off here. Now, you certainly don't want, a pop-up or notification every time a dwarf drops an item, because literally the game would be unplayable. So we're going to filter specifically down to Fortress mode because Adventure mode isn't in the game, at least as of the time of recording. Now, for sake of time, because this is a very, very, very long list of things, I'm just going to simply skip to the ones that I like to turn on and explain why. If you have some very specific thing that you want to look for, you'll have to filter through this list and find the items that you like the most. The first one that I like to turn on is Martial Trance. Now, Martial Trance is what happens when a dwarf gains the ability to not gain any kind of exhaustion during a fight. I like to follow dwarves that are in a martial trance, so I give myself a pop-up, a pause, and a recenter on those events. Because combat can be really, really quick, especially if you're running at the maximum frame rate. Combat can be up to 10 actions per second per dwarf in combat. That can be a lot of actions. So if you want to be very much aware of when your dwarves go into martial trance, I'd recommend turning this on. Next up, we have Ghost Attack. So this is when a ghost is actually attacking something. Ghosts can be quite violent if you're not careful. So you may want to turn this on if you want to be aware of where a ghost is attacking if you've got a problematic one, or just memorialize it so it's not an issue. Now, this is an interesting one, Found a Feature. So Found a Feature is you encountered something interesting on the map. This can happen in both Fortress mode and Adventure mode. In Adventure mode, it's like you found a cave. In Fortress mode, it's like, oh, you found an underground passage. You may want to turn on a recenter for this if you find, oh, I see the pop-up, but I don't know where it is, or, oh man, I already closed the notification, I don't feel like digging through the big menu to find it. You may want to just turn on recenter so that the game just jumps to that, but that is up to you. I generally leave it off. Praise the Miners, that's when you find a certain blue material. I like to know exactly where it is, so I like the game to pause and jump me to it. Well, pop-up is plenty, I don't actually need the pause, but as long as it jumps me to it so I know where it is and the game tells me. That's generally my biggest need there. Next up, we have Dig Cancel due to warm or Dig Cancel due to wet. If you want the game to recenter onto this, you can turn these on. Of course, you could also just completely disable the notification here. However, then you won't even know when it was paused and why. Next up, we have ambushes. Ambush Thief Skulking, Ambush Thief Nature, Ambush Thief Other. So Ambush and Thief and Ambush Resident. Resident is the cavern critters, so the creatures underground in the caverns. If you want to know exactly when an ambush is happening with the cavern critters, you may want to turn all of these on. Next up, we have Ambush Thief Nature. Ambush Thief or Nature is for elven invasions. So if you want to be immediately aware of when an elf is on, you may want to turn these on too. I also have it set so that it pauses for these, just because usually a dwarf is in danger in those given situations. Thief Other and Thief Skulking. Skulking is generally just, your local kobolds, and I don't worry about them so much. And then Ambush Thief, also, maybe you want to recenter on these, because let's just say that Ambush Thief, they might be trying to steal something important. And then Gremlins, I like to pause and pop up and pause and recenter on Gremlins purely because Gremlins are fun. Thief Other you can leave off because it's not a huge deal. Ambush Snatcher, these are the goblins that kidnap your children, so you may want to know exactly when that's happening and what's going on. I don't worry about the pop-ups, but I do want it to recenter. Same with Ambush Nature, that is when the elves are just directly attacking you, unlike the Thief Nature, which is when the elves are trying to steal from you. So I like to pop up, pause, and recenter on the Ambush Nature. Same with the generalized ambushes. There's a lot of different kinds of ambushes, shall we say. Now, one that confuses a lot of new players is Migrants. And the reason for this is Migrants, you get that tiny little pop-up with the little stick with the little baggie on it, and it teleports over to that dwarf. Now, or the dwarves coming into the fort. So I turn all of these on with the pop-up and the recenter. I don't worry about pausing, and the reason I do this is because I want to know immediately when there's Migrants and how many there is, and exactly what they're bringing, because it's just very important to be aware of it. And then for no Migrants, I just turn on a notification just so that the game tells me. I just like to be aware of things. You don't have to turn these on, of course. These are just my recommended settings. Then you could, if you wanted, turn on notifications for a diplomat entering the screen, but usually they enter the screen at the same time as a trade caravan, so it's not the biggest deal. But that being said, if you want to be aware of there being any kind of diplomatic characters on the map, you may want to turn those on. Next up, we have Strange Mood. This is another one that trips up new players a lot of the time. I set it so that it pops up and recenters and pauses generally on the Strange Mood because I want to know exactly what dwarf's in the Strange Mood and what they're going to go do, and then we can follow the artifact. Artifact made, this just tells you that the artifact is done, gives you the pop-up, and then given an item and name. This is usually military dwarves giving the items names. I like to turn the give item a name. I don't need a notification for that. purely because when a military dwarf names an item, it becomes legendary, but they don't have any interesting properties. It's just a matter of, do you want to read the name? And personally, I don't care all that much. Mega Beasts and Werebeasts, I do want the pause on the Werebeast and the recenter and the pop-up because I want to know that there's a Werebeast and exactly where it is as soon as possible when a Werebeast appears. And for Mega Beasts, I also want the pop-up and recenter, but I don't generally turn on the pause purely because they arrive at the edge of the map and you know about them right away, so it doesn't matter so much and I can just hit the pause button. Next up, we have endgame events. I want all of the pauses and recenters on endgame events for what I would hope to be logical reasons. Undead attack. This is the dead walk. Hide while you still can. I like to have the recenter and the pause as well as the notification on this. Next up are the merchants unloading, need depot, and bypassed site. I like the pop-ups for these. I like the pop-ups for the inaccessible site and need depot. As for them unloading, I don't need that so much because they've already made it to the depot. Next up, we have dwarves throwing tantrums, which is useful to know, in my opinion. I like the pop-up. I don't need the full screen pause or recenter or anything on that. But if a dwarf is tantruming, I want to know immediately. The rest of these, we can just leave off, at least as far as I'm concerned. Next up, we have demands and mandates. If you're a newer player and you want to be aware of when there's a demand or a mandate from a noble, being your mayor or a king or a queen or something else, the demand mandates and the new mandates, those might be useful for a new player because if you can keep your nobles happy, then they do a better job comforting citizens when they're upset, acting kind of like the dwarven therapist for that portion of the community. Might be useful to have on, but personally, I'm pretty careful about keeping track of my nobles' demands, so I don't see it as necessary. Just wanted to make you aware that that is an option, though. Next up, we've got some more ghost events. I like to have the pop-ups for these. Tantrum, possessed by ghost, and building toppled by ghost. I find those to be very useful. And next up, we have weddings. Weddings, I do like to have the recenter and the pop-up, but you obviously don't need the pause for that. The reason I like the weddings notifications is because it gives me a pretty good idea of who's getting married, and I can look at all their thoughts, and weddings don't happen super often, so it's, in my opinion, worth noting. Thief, villain, these are characters that are trying to steal your artifacts. I like to have the pop-up to be aware that somebody's trying to steal my stuff. Same with all these. These are all related to artifacts getting stolen, with the exception of these bottom two, so don't worry about them. But witnessed handoff, witnessed stolen. I want the recenter. I want the pop-up. I want to know who did it. I want to know who witnessed it, and I want to know where it's going so I can kill the dude who's trying to steal my sword. Next up, we have site founded nearby. I want the pop-up. We don't need the recenter on that. And then nearby site linked economically, I also want the notification. These are for new locations that are associated with my fortress getting built. Next up, if you want to be immediately aware when a guild is founded, you can turn this on. I don't personally find this one necessary. You get a guild founded when you have 10 dwarves of a particular skill, so just keep that in mind if you want to be aware of when a guild is made. Next up, we have the first caravan. I like to recenter on the first caravan so I know exactly where they're coming from. This one has a specifically written piece of dialogue for it, which is always kind of fun. I also like to just know what part of the map they're walking from, so I turn that on. The rest of these, they don't need a recenter, but the pop-ups are very useful. Last in this screen, Cursed by Deity. Cursed by a Deity is a pretty important thing to turn on, in my opinion, because when a thing is cursed by a thing, you want to know exactly what thing is being cursed by the thing and what kind of curse they got. So you may need to isolate them immediately upon this happening. So I want the pop-up, I want the pause, and I want the recenter. As for new apprenticeship, I just like the pop-up, because I like to know when somebody becomes somebody's apprentice. All right, on to difficulty. So by default, you can turn enemies off, enemies onto hard, and you can turn the economy to hard normal. Economy makes trading more expensive. It makes all the items more expensive, and it makes your items less expensive. It also makes guild halls and temples harder to satisfy. Instead of needing 2,000 and 6,000, you need, 2,000 and 10,000 to satisfy them, you need 10,000 and 30,000, which is a significantly higher amount of value, plus your items are worth less. So the economy, if you want, is a thing that you turn on if you want to have to build very large, very detailed, very busy rooms full of lots of stuff. Can be a fun little challenge, in my opinion. I quite like the economy on hard, but we'll just leave it on default for right now. Next up, we have custom settings. Now, this one, there's a few things specifically that I want to point out. If you're having trouble with werebeasts, like werewolves, pangolins, were lizards, were sheep, were moose, were mammoths, were whatever, you can disable them. completely. They won't attack you. This won't protect you, however, from visitors that may have wearisms, but it will stop them from invading you altogether. Same with Mega Beasts. Mega Beasts are your giant, your Forgotten Beasts, your Titans, your Bronze Colossi, your Dragons. Those are your Mega Beasts, so you can disable those as well, and then Civilizations. But from here, if you set your population lower because you have a tiny baby PC and you don't really want there to be enemies attacking you, or you want enemies to still attack you, but at more reasonable numbers, let's say your computer can run 50 dwarves, then what I would recommend is setting, or maybe leaving this one at default, the population 1, and then turning this down to 30, so enemy siege trigger at 30, and then let's just say enemy size siege trigger at 40, and then enemy size siege trader at 55, and then let's just say 70. And then you can also change the amount of value your fort needs for them to attack you. You can also, if we scroll down a little bit, change the size of the sieges that they can send. So we could say, all right, let's send a invasion cap of monsters, okay, an invasion cap of regulars, an invasion cap of monsters on attack 3, and then what we can do is we can say, okay, the maximum amount of goblins I want to have attacking me, let's just say 50, right? And then the maximum amount of mounts that they can bring, which are usually beak dogs. They're supposed to also bring trolls, which I haven't seen at all in a very long time, which makes me start to think that trolls might be bugged. I think Tarntuk don't feed the trolls a little bit too seriously. But invasion cap monsters attack 3, let's say set that to 20. So the second attack we could do 20 and 5, and then just let's say 5. So now we have a pretty balanced game for a smaller population cap. So let's say we can only have a maximum of 80 dwarves. Now suddenly we have the correct triggers and we have the correct number of attackees to be able to enjoy the game on an older PC. Of course, you could also go in the other direction and be like, yo, I want 500 monsters, I want 500 goblins, and I don't want any pulling punches here. I want them to just send like the maximum size siege immediately on their first attack. If you really want to suffer, I need to do another fort like this soon. You can really turn those numbers up and make things, let's just say, very vile when the forces of darkness arrive. Next up, you can say minimum number of raids before first siege, which is, by the way, they send those little scouting parties, right? So that's what this first one is. Those are the initial raids, the tiny little one of these. Invasion cap, these tiny little attackers. That first one is the number of sieges that can happen. So essentially, if you want them to just send the biggest siege, set that number to 1, is what that means. Then, of course, you can make sieges more or less frequent, and you can do the other stuff. And then there's this one. This is one that I constantly recommend people change. If you're having trouble with cavern dwellers, the little fish people or ant people or guys that hang out in the caverns, regardless of what I'm doing and what my goal is for that particular fort, I usually set this to 5. By default, it's 10 and 50. So if it's set to 10 and 50, they will arrive in groups of 10, and they'll slowly stack up and fill up the caverns. They do have a maximum number. I think it's about 200. It's supposed to be about 200, but sometimes they just keep spawning anyway. But if you set it to 3 and 5, then instead of having, big gluts of like 400 amphibian men in the basement, if the game decided to just keep spawning them, you'll have a glut of like, let's just say 15, which one is significantly more possible to deal with if you're not 100% set up for it, and 2, to me, makes them a fun nuisance instead of a annoying drawback to digging into the caverns. I quite like having this setting as is. I know it's making the game a lot easier, but that's not where I want to get my difficulty from in the caverns. I want that to come from the Mega Beasts, the Forgotten Beasts, the deeper, darker horrors of the game. Next, if you have trouble with elves or don't like dealing with the limits that they demand for the number of trees that you can up and down per year, you could say, yo, these elves, they don't care so much about the trees. They'll let me chop down 150 trees per year so I can have all of the wood I want and not be at war with them. But by default, it is 25, so, you set that to what you want. Next up, since I was talking a little bit about the economy difficulty, if you want to customize the economy difficulty, you can do that down here. So you could set it so that guild halls need very, very low value if you don't want super high value guild halls. Same with temples. If that is a mechanic in the game that bothers you, nerf it, and you can do that here. Do you want to have very high value buildings? You can also do that as well. Increase these numbers tenfold, and good luck actually producing them. Now, the next thing, and kind of the final one that I really want to cover in these difficulty options, is right beneath these like Mega Beast sensitivity notifiers here. We have wilderness sensitivity, wilderness irritation, and wilderness irritation decay. So, as an example of this, I'm playing on an Untamed Wilds biome right now in my most current playthrough, which is a glacier, meaning there is no trees and almost nothing I can actually do to, air quotes, damage the surface, meaning it's very difficult for, even though it's the fact that it's an Untamed Wilds biome, it's very difficult to make those creatures attack me. So, what I've been doing is I've been planning to turn these so that they will attack me easier, meaning I only need to place a couple wall pieces before I start getting agitated giant polar bears or whatever, or giant albatrosses. Because I'm getting none of them because there's no trees on the surface and there's no plants on the surface and there's no fish on the surface, it's very difficult to actually increase the amount of agitation I get in the wilderness. So if I make this number lower, let's just say 300 instead of 1,000, the speed at which stuff is going to attack me is going to be very low. So the lower you make that number, the quicker things attack you. And if you want them to attack you for a shorter period of time, because believe it or not, the wildlife agitation in a Untamed Wilds biome increases while you're damaging the wildlife and then decreases when you are not damaging the wildlife. So if you increase the amount of decay, then it'll go from waves of agitated wildlife attacking, to that number going down quicker. So you can set it so that the second you start touching the wildlife, you get bombed by, 50 giant bears, but you could also set it so that you only need to deal with one wave, and then they're done. Or you can make it so that you have to do a lot of damage, but then it takes a very long time for them to go away. Contort the game the way you like. Like, really, that is the best way to enjoy Dwarf Fortress. So I think it is best to dig very deeply into these civilization and difficulty settings so that you can create the game that you want. And then if you decide you want to change it, well, just hit normal again, and it'll all go back to normal. Thank you very much for watching this video. This ended up being way too long to fit into the quick tutorials section. I don't know where I'm going to put it now. Probably just a Dwarf Fortress tutorial. Regardless, this has been my, I guess, recommended settings for Dwarf Fortress. We'll do one of DF Hacks soon. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.